Thank you for those very kind words, Dr. Violet. Ladies and gentlemen, proud families, graduates, it's amazing how much has changed since my graduation. Of my 56 classmates, only 2 were women. And apart from a few Americans, there was no one from abroad. About 20 have died, and only 1 graduate in our class had a beard, moi. Which, I might add, Dean Collop pointed out disapprovingly. And finally, I'm quite certain that no alumnus received an honorary degree at our graduation. That brings me to the first of several reasons why this recognition is so special. It's because it comes from my alma mater. Academics understand well the biblical saying, "A prophet is not without honor save in his own land." This is an expression that's used, and I quote, of anyone whose talents and accomplishments are highly regarded by everyone except those at home. That's remarkably accurate, I discovered, because when I told our children about this great honor, our youngest son, a lawyer, replied by email, "Congratulations, one of these days we'll have to start taking you seriously." I'm sorry to report that he still doesn't. A second reason this is special is because so much of my professional life has been devoted to advocacy. In part, prophets are advocates, but like many in biblical times, my words usually fell on deaf ears. Certainly, that's true of my efforts to persuade successive Canadian governments and governments elsewhere to view injuries as a serious public health problem, the serious problem that they are. And in my earlier life, as Dr. Violet pointed out, it was also true of my attempts to persuade clinicians that children with chronic physical illnesses required special emotional support. So, President Chakma, Western is bestowing this degree on someone who judges that much of his work only deserves a C+ grade. Nevertheless, I want to offer some reflections for you all to mull over during your next 50 years. Before I applied to medicine, I thought I wanted to be a writer and was leaning towards doing a degree in sociology and philosophy at the University of Toronto, forgive me. My father argued that if I chose medicine, he wanted me to be a physician, obviously, I could still write, and he rhymed off some examples of physicians who were great novelists: Anton Chekhov, Somerset Maugham, Arthur Conan Doyle, and our own A.J. Cronin. I followed his advice. I applied to Western, and miraculously, and I assure you it was a miracle because the application came in July of the same year, I was accepted. The next 6 years, 2 years of pre-meds and 4 years of medicine, were among the best of my life, surpassed only by the births of our 3 children and our 5 grandchildren. Later, during my residency, I completed a BA, and then, as my dad predicted, I began to write. Several books, many papers, and lots of editorials and commentaries which seemed to have moved no one. I also saw patients and did research. Who could ask for anything more? Well, I confess I did want something more. I wanted a PhD. And I have a hunch that the degree that I've just received is the closest I'll ever come to achieving that goal. I wanted a PhD because I so envied the wisdom of my graduate students, my doctoral students in particular, just as I envied the satisfactions of the many dedicated science clinicians that I've worked with. And most of all, I admire clinician scientists who do both. Western's Bachelor of Medical Sciences program, the degree that it confers, which many of you will receive today, seems an absolutely brilliant way to generate more of this rare and desperately needed breed. Now, all of this comes together to explain why I was so very pleased to learn that this convocation includes graduates in both science and medicine. I hope that among the doctors here, there may even be a few who will become pediatricians because they, like me, had learned how to wiggle their ears and make funny noises, which is, of course, the main reason I chose that specialty. I mean, I figured once I had those skills, I might as well build on it. I assume some of today's graduates will become investigators, researchers, and the rest will be knowledge consumers. For the researchers, especially clinician researchers, there are some storm clouds ahead. For years, I've been troubled by what appears to be a growing gap between lab scientists and clinical researchers. What wasn't said was that I was head of clinical research at the Montreal Children's for 15 years, and I was in a constant battle. It's like the two solitudes described in McLennan's 1945 novel by that name, which happened to deal with French-English struggles, but this two solitudes today come from the mistaken belief that what lab scientists do is harder than what clinical researchers do. And the hard-soft battle implies that one is better, that is more scientific, than the other. And too often the two sides compete for resources, for recognition, for promotion, and so forth. Now, it's true that bench scientists can usually measure things with remarkable precision, and by all means, they can more easily conduct randomized experiments. But conversely, clinical investigators, especially those who were wise enough to include some epidemiology in their training, are often more skilled at research design and data analysis, biostatistics, and the like. What I want is to convince both sides that the relationship between them should not continue to be adversarial, but instead they need to work more closely. If they do, the lab scientists will better appreciate how really complex patient care can be and how essential it is, for example, once you come up with that new medicine, that you take the problems of compliance into account. And by the same token, the clinical researchers will gain a better grasp of the underlying biochemical and physiologic processes. So my prescription for solving the two solitudes problem is to stop talking about hard and soft, but like eggs, cultivated taste for scrambling the two. Now that may sound easy, but to complicate matters, although funding bodies in Canada in recent years are now paying more attention to clinical research, clinician investigators still face huge challenges. Funding nowadays is far more competitive, and this may be compounded by recent changes announced by CIHR, for example, in the peer review process, changes that, in my view, remain unproven and should be tested before they're implemented. The emphasis on so-called integrated knowledge translation is something I've been promoting for years, but before it too becomes a requirement, it needs to be tested. And there are many other catchy phrases that touch on this issue. Translational research was one that I wasn't sure I fully understood, and so I Googled it, and I found something written by the dean of Stanford Medical School, who described it as, and I quote, research by a physician-scientist working at the interface between the lab and patient care, or by a team of basic and clinical science investigators. I might add that the dean who wrote that, Phil Pizzo, was one of my students in Rochester. But his greatest claim to fame was that about 44 years ago, he and his wife Peggy babysat our two oldest children. And he credits that experience with inspiring him to do pediatrics, which may or may not be true. To summarize, the hard-soft gap is still far too large and may actually be widening. We need to make it easier for clinicians to work with bench scientists and vice versa, and thus make the much heralded bench-to-bedside idea a far more common reality than it is now. It's hyped a lot more than it's practiced, I assure you. An article in the Canadian Medical Association Journal last year in their 100th anniversary issue reminded us that Frederick Banting was a GP when he found his way into a laboratory, discovered insulin, and won a Nobel Prize. But as the author of that article in the CMAJ observed, and I quote, "The distance between the GP consulting room," this was an English woman who wrote it, "and the laboratory has continued to widen." Anyway, on that rather down note, I conclude this sermon on the two solitudes, but before I conclude completely, I want to add a few final thoughts. First, I want to remind you that there is more to life than your professional work. I urge you to find some enjoyable outside interest and let it help balance the pain and even the joy of your day job. For me, that something has mostly been writing, with which I still have a love-hate relationship. And if you don't understand what I mean, you've never tried to write the perfect paper. But writing well as you possibly can, is far more important to your career than you might now think. And there's only one secret to good writing: revise, revise, and revise. And although, I might add, most of my writing is still work-related, for the past 5 years I've been struggling with a children's book, which my grandson Elias still doesn't approve of, and with a short story or two. For good measure, I play a clarinet. My wife gave me for my 50th birthday. It gives me, and only me, much pleasure. Even though another son, who's an exceptional pianist and family doctor, insists that until I learn to count, I'll never be any good. And counting is a real drag. And to rub it in, after a gap of over 70 years since my last lesson, he arranged for me to start taking piano lessons again just this last year with his excellent teacher. And finally, I urge that you not get so wrapped up in your professional lives that your family ends up playing second fiddle, pardon the pun. If you do become an academic, that lecture you'll eventually be asked to give at Toronto or even McGill or Paris is no doubt flattering. But I assure you that your audience will survive if you decide to say no for family reasons. But, and this is the take-home message, so please listen carefully, you will always pay a price for the time you're away from home. First steps and first words only happen once and should never be missed. Now, as I look back on what I've said today, I hope you don't conclude that what I'm urging is that you follow in my footsteps. If anything, it's the opposite, except perhaps for the clarinet and piano, of course. In fact, you may well be thinking, if Pless had followed his own advice, would he be here today? Probably not, but deep down, I would judge it a fair trade. So I conclude by giving my heartfelt thanks to to my wife Anne, and to Tamara, Charles, Jabin, and our eldest grandson Elias, and Alexander, all of whom are here today. Rocco, Romeo, Elizabeth, Oscar, Emma, and Ollie could not join us. Thank you all for listening, and thank you, Western, for this wonderful honor.